All right, well, I'm excited to announce today's speaker. We have Mike Mullet. He's with Highland Rivers. I want to read his bio. It says, Mike Mullet has been a professional communicator for more than 30 years. During that time, he's worked for more than a decade with public health agencies in Michigan and Georgia, and also spent nearly a decade working with private public relation agencies in Atlanta. His work has included work with clients in such diverse industries as manufacturing, energy development, mining, finance, food service, and hospitality. And his writings has been published literally hundreds of times in trade journals, newspapers, and online outlets. For the past 5 years, Mike has worked as a community relations director for Highland Rivers, which is one of Georgia's largest providers of behavioral health services and serves 12 counties in northwest Georgia, including Whitfield County. This is, he says, the best place he's ever worked and the best job he's ever had. Today, in honor of May being Mental Health Awareness Month, Mike is going to share some information about Highland Rivers Health, some interesting facts about mental illness and substance use, and tell you how you can contribute to these efforts in Dalton and Whitfield County. So let's welcome Mike.
I won't forget. All right. Set the water.
All right.
Well, good afternoon. Like I said, my name is Mike Mullet, and it's Mullet with one T, like the haircut. And as you can probably tell, one place I have not been in the last year is to the barber shop. So it's the only midlife crisis I can afford. Again, thanks so much. And it's great to be able to go out and speak to people in person, as I'm sure it is to be able to get out and be in person and have lunch together. It is Mental Health Awareness Month in May. And I wanted to share a little bit today about Highland Rivers Health, the agency. You've probably seen the signs. You hear about it from time to time. Not a lot of people know everything that we do. And then I also want to talk about a great lunch topic of mental illness, because there is a lot of misconceptions about mental illness and what it means to have mental illness. Now, I'll start off by telling you myself, I've had mental illness. I don't live with mental illness, but I've had it, and it's rough. And you probably look in here and say, well, yeah, I guess that we're not surprised to hear that, Mike. You know? But yeah, back in 2012, you know, my brother had passed away, and 3 months later, my mother passed away, and it was a rough year. We had grief-related mental illness, and I got depression. And you say, well, yeah, you know, it would be normal to be depressed after something like that. 2 deaths in your family in a period of 3 months, and my grandma in between the two. And it was normal, I think, to be depressed following that. But what wasn't normal was going through a period and having those classic symptoms where I don't feel like getting out of bed in the morning. They say that's true. I feel like when I go to my job, I'm a fraud and nothing I do makes a difference. And I just don't feel like playing my guitar. That's when my wife really knew something was wrong. Those things aren't normal. Those things aren't normal when your mind starts edging toward, you know, maybe my family would be better off without me because I'm really not contributing anything to the family. Right? None of that was true, of course, but that's how I felt. And I began to see a therapist, and a therapist is a wonderful thing. If you've never been to one, geez, I recommend it, even if you're feeling great, because they provide an objective take on your life and things that you say. And all of our therapists at the agency see therapists too, because there's just so much that goes on, and sometimes you need somebody to talk to. And I was prescribed medication to help with that, antidepressant, and a little bit of tranquilizer to kind of stem the panic attacks that I developed over there. And if you've ever had one of those, you know, the first time you have one, you think, am I dying or what? And it's very frightening. And it took about 6 or 8 months, but I eventually regained my equilibrium and haven't had any problems since. It took a long time for me to be able to stand up and say, well, I've had mental illness, because we all have no problem saying, well, yeah, I had COVID last year, or I broke my leg, or I had a heart attack and it was rough. But boy, tell somebody you've had mental illness, and it's like, ooh, well, listen, I gotta run, but it was good to talk to you. Okay. scares people. They don't know what to do with it. But it's a lot more common than people think, and a lot of times it's temporary. So I want to tell you some about that. And before, just sort of a quick overview of our agency. Like I said, we're a large agency. Uh-oh. Okay. There we go. We're going to start with some very basic stuff. What is Highland Rivers Health? We are what's known as a community service board. There are 24 community service boards in the state of Georgia. These agencies are designated by the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities. Community service boards are safety net agencies. So we exist to serve people who otherwise would not have access to services. And that includes people who are generally low income, have Medicaid, Medicare, and not necessarily the resources to go get help if they need it. So now I will grant you that community service board is not a very sexy title, and it doesn't say what it really is that we do. So community service boards like Highland Rivers, we deliver services and supports for people who are struggling with mental illness, with substance use disorders, and with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Simple enough. Public health department, you get that? We are like a public health department for behavioral health. And it's called behavioral health because those illnesses tend to manifest themselves in a person's behaviors. And all of the community service boards work with a range of people, adults, children, adolescents, families, veterans. We are one of the largest providers of behavioral health services to veterans in Georgia. We partner with the Atlanta VA, and not surprisingly, all of the CSBs in Georgia were designated as an essential service during the pandemic. So we didn't shut down, but we sure as heck did adapt, and it was very challenging to go through a pandemic, and I could spend a whole hour on that, but I'm not, on working with individuals who are already living with mental illness while we have this added layer of pandemic on top of that. Couple things to know about our agency. Well, we're one of the largest CSBs in Georgia. We have over $50 million budget. 88 cents of every dollar that we earn goes directly into services for the individuals we serve. We've got about 650 employees, so it's not uncommon for somebody to say, hey, do you know? And I don't know, but that doesn't mean that they don't work for us. About 15,000 a year. We provide services really all over the place. So our outpatient clinics, certainly, but in the communities, we have services in schools. We operate residential facilities. There's a couple counties that we serve where we provide services in the jails, which is really a good thing. And we meet with people in their homes. And you can see we run there from, on the left-hand side, from Alabama state line up to the top there, North Carolina and Tennessee. And then over in the corner, right, there's 4 more counties, which are Catoosa, Chattooga, Walker, and Dade. And those are Lookout Mountain Community Services. If you've heard of that agency, that too is a community service board. And it serves those 4 counties. So no matter where you live in Georgia, there's a community service board that serves your county. And I want to show you a quick video about our agency. We had these done a couple years ago. Several of the individuals who are in these videos are receiving services or were at the time. And I'll give you a little idea about how recovery works and what it means.
Life wounds all of us in very distinct and deeply personal ways, and it creates separateness and disconnection. It's about that opportunity to provide hope, to provide resources, and holding out that there is a life with greater promise and a life that can be really fulfilling. Highland Rivers is very privileged to be part of a Northwest Georgia system of care. We're considered a safety net provider, serve about 18,000 people a year. Child, adolescents, youth, adults, their families, adults with mental illness, adults with substance abuse issues, and also adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Recovery is the heart of Highland Rivers. It's really about how do we identify what a specific individual's needs are, and then we look kind of across a menu of services or opportunities to serve them best.
We're just a place where we receive you where you are at that moment, and we help you become the next best version of yourself. Recovery, I think, is a daily decision just to make the right, healthy choices, just to choose the next best thing for you every single day.
I enjoy him being in here because it helps him to become a better person. When you get on the road, it's a long road. When you have people that are willing to help you and keep you on that road and keep you from veering off, it means the world.
They want you to succeed. That's what they're all about. Coming in second, going out well. I can never thank the Lord enough. Highland River. As long as I'm out of bus, I'll be right here.
All right, so you probably saw some interesting things there. I want to point out that the man with the beer, the Vietnam veteran, we went in to film him a couple years ago, and what we didn't tape was he told his whole story from the war and the special ops, and our jaws were on the floor by the time we were done with that. The things that some people have gone through that they carry with them, you know. But he lives with PTSD, and it wasn't until about 40 years after the fact that he started having the nightmares, started getting agitated, you know, feeling like I'm not feeling right. And PTSD is an interesting one. It manifests a lot of different ways and sometimes take time. So he was a lieutenant colonel in the armed forces during Vietnam, and did a lot of interesting things. But anyway, yeah, what they talk about there is recovery, and I think people understand recovery a lot of times in the context of substance use disorder and drug use, but recovery also applies to individuals with mental illness. Just like an individual with substance use lives in recovery by not using, and they make that daily choice to, I'm not going to use and live my life. It's the same for people living with chronic mental illness, where they can live in recovery in a way that their illness doesn't interfere with their ability to live day to day independently in the community. And obviously there's different levels of support that people need for that. These next few slides, I just wanted to present. I'm not going to talk about each one individually or read you that, but I wanted to be sure they were in the slides because I think you're going to post them or have them available after the fact. And so there is a reference, but you can see that we provide a lot of different types of services depending on what individuals need. Those 9 photos are our 9 outpatient clinics. Community-based services, I always want to be sure to mention because those are the services where we go out and meet with people in their homes. Like if you see a Highland Rivers Health building, you know, that's our facility, but these community-based services kind of go on below the radar. Assertive community treatment is very highly intensive, where we may visit someone at their home 4 times a week with a psychiatrist and a case manager and a therapist and a peer support services or a peer support person. And they get a little less intensive depending on what the needs are. Maybe it's every couple weeks we visit somebody, but these services, people don't see them because they don't have a building associated with them, and yet they allow people to really be supported and live in the community. So just a variety of mental health services based on individual needs. It's the same with substance use services, crisis stabilization and detoxification. We do have a program specifically for opioid addiction. We operate 2 residential facilities, one in Rome and one in Jasper. I know if you've spoken to anyone who is living in recovery with substance use, you know that stopping using is an important part of that, but it's a lot of times not all there is to it to living in recovery. 28-day rehab, 30-day rehab, you've heard of that. A lot of times that's not quite enough. So our residential programs are about 6 months each, 6 to 9 months. Help people not use. About 90% of individuals that we see with substance use disorder also have underlying mental health diagnosis. And a lot of times people with mental health will start using to treat the symptoms, to self-medicate, because addiction is a brain disorder as well. Kind of goes together. So there's that. They may need a safe place to live. They may need parenting classes. They may need to get their kids out of foster care and do the work for all of that. So these programs are about 6 to 9 months each. But when they get done, individuals are set up to live in recovery and continuing to receive support. So again, child and adolescent services is another one. We have a lot of services specifically targeted to individuals or to children because mental illness, if you're going to get it, usually starts when a child is young. And sometimes, and I had teenage boys myself back in the day, and you know, they're nuts anyway at that age. Sometimes it can be hard to tell whether what they're going through is a result of being, 14, 15 years old, and they're being moody and adolescent, or if there's really something wrong there. On average, children wait 8 to 10 years before they start, except from when they first start having symptoms to when they receive services. There's a lot of stigma. Parents don't recognize it. Parents don't want to recognize it. They just don't know. If you're of a certain age, which I am, you probably remember back in elementary school, boy, there was always just that one bad kid in class. The bad kid that spent a lot of time in the corner or had to move his desk next to the teacher's desk and would get suspended. We know now that I think that bad kid probably had a lot more going on than just being a bad kid. And a lot of our services now are focused on working with the whole family, like the Apex school-based services, where we have a therapist that actually has an office in the school, works with staff and administrators to identify kids who are maybe having some emotional problems, need some extra support, move them into services and their families as well. So, so mental health services, substance use services, specifically child and adolescent services. Another part of what we do is services for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So all those three categories of services are what our mandate is from the Department of Behavioral Health, Developmental Disabilities, for what a community service board does. Day programs, we have a lot of residential services for individuals with disabilities. That picture in the middle between the kaleidoscope and the other one is it's just up the road here off of Cleveland Highway. We have a day program up there for individuals with disabilities too. So those are sort of the big 3 to 4 categories of what we do, what we as a community service board does. And it's a lot. So that's why we have 650 people, about $54 million a year. And like I said, about 88 cents of every dollar we make goes directly into services. So if you visit our facilities, they're not glamorous. They're not glamorous, but that's okay. We are helping improve people's lives, and that's what gets me up and going to work every day. Is this is just great work to do. I want to talk about now a topic that a lot of people don't want to talk about because it scares people. And if you think just a generation ago, 30 years ago, what did we do with people with mental illness? We put them away in an institution where we didn't have to, for their own safety, right? But really, I think it was a lot about we didn't want to encounter them in the community on the street. And I wonder if the symptoms I had where I was depressed, 9 years ago now, if I had done that and it had been in the 1950s, would I have gotten treatment and a therapist, or would I have just been taken and, well, he's depressed and he's probably not going to get over it, and not really focused on recovery. So things have changed. We've learned a lot about mental illness and its treatment, but it still continues to be a scary thing. One thing I noticed when it comes to mental illness versus physical illness is the go, get. You work in an office or a school, you come in, you see one of your staff sitting there at his or her desk and got the sniffles and the fever. And what do we say to that person? Go home, get some rest, and get well or better. Absolutely. When you encounter somebody sitting at their desk crying because they're depressed, and I was there, And I'll tell you, my boss didn't like it. You know, there's just no way around. But what do we say to people with a mental illness who might be having an episode? We tell them to go take a break, get yourself together, and get back to work. So why the difference? Maybe we've been raised that way. Maybe it's just not raised that way, but it seems to be kind of the norm in society. We don't really want to engage with people who might be depressed or might be having a bad day because we don't know what to do and it scares us. Well, a lot of people have mental illness in their lifetime. Like I said, I'm one of them, but actually 1 in 5 US adults will experience a mental illness every year. That's a lot. That's 20%. 1 in 5 adults will have a mental illness. They've had it in the past, they're experiencing right now, they will have it in the future. And like I say, when you go out, and now that you can go out again at church or at your children's school or at the baseball game, look around and do the math. 1 in 5. I know somebody's thinking, well, I was said Peggy wasn't right, and she may not be, but it's a lot. So 1 in 5. I'm one of the 1 in 5. And if you can stare not at people and look around and do the math in here, you know, but there's nothing, you know, there's really no shame in that. And yet it's very common and it still scares us. So 1 in 5 adults will experience a mental illness in their lifetime. A lot of times it's just a temporary, it's kind of a bump in the road like mine was. A lot of people don't experience mental illness, but they don't live with it and have to manage it for the rest of their lives. So what I say is, you know, diabetes affects roughly 1 in 10 people. So if you know somebody with diabetes, you're about twice as likely to know someone who has or will have or has had a mental illness in their lifetime. 1 in 20 US adults experience a serious mental illness each year. A lot of those are able to recover too. So with serious mental illness, when you're talking schizoaffective disorder, severe bipolar disorder, a little more serious than depression. 1 in 6 youth, age 16 to 17, 6 to 17 experience a mental health disorder each year. So that's roughly the same as adults. And 50% of all lifetime cases of mental illness begin by age 14, 75% by age 24. That's why some of our child and adolescent services are so important, because it starts young a lot of times. And like I said, a lot of times it can be hard to recognize if what your child is going through is just being defiant because he or she is 13, or if there's really something wrong there. I'd say err on the side of caution, even if your child resists, you never know. But half the battle there is getting the adult, the parent, to say, well, maybe there's something wrong with my kid. And it's a hard thing to do. I have a son that lives with a depressive anxiety disorder. It started when he was around 22, which is about the age that those things will show up. And it's hard. And even as a parent, even the field I work in, you're like, you know, it's so tempting to sometimes say, geez, I just wish he'd get over it. He won't. He won't get over it. He lives with it. He's learned how to manage it. And we're very supportive of him, my wife and I, but it's hard. So if cases of mental illness start, they tend to start early. And suicide is the second leading cause of death among people 10 to 34. That's young. That's young. Yet we have seen the rates go up. So some facts about mental illness, a couple others. You can see here, anxiety disorders, by far the biggest thing that the mental illness that people experience, followed by depression, PTSD. Schizophrenia and bipolar disorder are very rare, and yet they seem to get the most attention, you know. Schizophrenia, where people might see things, might hear things, but in a lot of cases, mental illness is temporary. It was in my case, but it doesn't get better unless you go get treatment for it. Also, interestingly enough, some populations seem to be much more at risk for mental health conditions, and you can see down there at the bottom gay, lesbian, bisexual, very at risk for mental illness, and also mixed race. Again, 21% of all adults. You know, certainly being othered, being scrutinized, being, it's the word I'm looking for, told that you're not quite as good as people, that can be traumatic, that can cause, you know, can certainly increase the risk of mental illness. I haven't done a PowerPoint in so long. I was like, I'm going to throw some animation in this one. You know? If you take nothing else with you today, I want you to know that mental illness, with the right services and supports, people can recover. It doesn't necessarily mean that they won't have it anymore, but it means they know how to manage it. And again, I go back to the example of diabetes, where if somebody has that, they may inject insulin, they're watching what they're eating, they're taking medication, they're exercising, hopefully, unless you're my mother, you don't do any of that. But they're managing that illness so it doesn't impact their ability to live. So it doesn't mean they have to be hospitalized or have an amputation or worse yet, you know, cause them to pass away. Same with mental illness and substance use disorder. People learn to manage them, to live in recovery. Sometimes it's just a medication will do it. Sometimes medication and therapy. Sometimes we are visiting them at home 3 or 4 times a week. But they're learning to live with it and manage it so it doesn't affect their ability to live, to work, to be a mother or father. So that's living in recovery. It's hard, you know, it's hard to do for people with mental illness. And yet that's one of the, when you, so many of these individuals that were in this, the video I showed you, you know, they were living with chronic mental illness, and it's hard. And I have a lot of compassion for them, because on top of everything else that goes along with having to live day to day and making decisions, and they had to manage this disease all the time. And sometimes it's a moment to moment thing. But like any set of skills, the longer you do it, the more you get it, the more help you get, the better you get at it. So here's some things that might help things. We definitely need more funding for community-based primary behavioral health care. We know that for physical health, the ability to go see your family doctor for the little things helps reduce the risk of them becoming big things. It's the same with behavioral health care, especially mental health. And every year when my CEO, Melanie Dallas, and I, we go down and visit the legislators from our district down at the Capitol and say we need more funding for core behavioral health services, the primary mental health care, the primary behavioral health care. And we need more education about behavioral health and behavioral health care. I know that it seems like younger people today are a little more open about having mental health challenges, and I think that's a good thing. But again, more education about what mental illness is, what addiction is, and how it can be treated and how people can live with that. I would love to see better enforcement of mental health parity laws, because, you know, if you have private insurance, supposedly there's a law that says, well, you got to treat and pay for mental health treatment as much as you pay for physical health treatment. Yet I think that rarely happens. I know the insurance I had when I was seeing a therapist paid for 5 visits in 6 months. Not quite enough. So we had out of pocket, but they were supposed to pay for it as much as you would pay for physical therapy or something like that. Another trend, and we've seen this some, is continued integration of behavioral health care into existing community institutions. That is a really good thing and works well. For APEX program in schools, we're starting to see mental health court and behavioral court, or drug courts. Jails, we provide services in a couple jails. And why that's really important is if an individual in incarceration, you know, and it's like, 50% of people incarcerated now have a diagnosable mental illness. Since the mental hospitals have changed, have closed, our jails and prisons, unfortunately, have become the new mental hospitals. If we can begin to see someone in incarceration, then we have that relationship established and can continue that when they're released. Too often what's happened is that individual may get a couple visits from the jailhouse therapist while they're there, and when they get out, they're given a card that says, here, call Highland Rivers, or call Avita Partners, depending on where you are, or call Lookout Mountain Community Services. Are they gonna call? Maybe, probably not. And they fall through the cracks. And then what happens? They end up in the crisis unit, or they end up reoffending and they go back. So the more that we can integrate behavioral health care into these is probably going to help things. Hospital emergency departments, again, people present at the emergency department all the time in behavioral health crisis, and they don't need to be hospitalized, but there's nothing else that can be done with them a lot of time. We have we actually have a program with Hamilton over here where we have a therapist that works in the ED some hours, and when people come in with a behavioral health crisis, we provide an assessment for them, and if they don't need to be hospitalized, I mean, we can take them to our crisis unit, we can refer them to outpatient services, we can help stabilize them and step them down, because hospital care is expensive. So the more that we can integrate that, and it's the same with that primary behavioral health care. I think communities that have that a lot tend not to have these people end up in jails and prisons. So the more that we can treat and have people get treatment and help before they end up in crisis, before they commit a crime, it saves money on the back end of it too, just like primary health care. So what can you do? We all have a responsibility, I think. First thing, I say, watch your language. I know it's okay to say, well, that person's mentally ill, and it sounds like political correctness to say person with mental illness, and here we go again. But it really makes a difference. We refer to the people who see us as individuals because they really are. They have an individual story. They have an individual background. They have individual needs. They have individual preferences and desires of what they want to do. So we always talk about don't call people their diagnosis. And it's important. If we heard some people say that all the time, maybe we begin to see as they're people first instead of a disease or a diagnosis. So addict, but a person with addiction, a person with substance use disorder. I know it sounds politically correct, but it's important how we talk about mental illness. Compassion is a big one too. Compassion, compassion, compassion. It's like real estate, location, location, location. One thing I've really learned as I've worked for Highland Rivers Health is compassion. If you personally have a mental illness, it may be a family member, it may be a coworker. Everybody is impacted by mental illness at some place in their life, whether they have it or not. And it can be tough because some people with mental illness become aggressive and belligerent, and you don't want to deal with that. And I get it. And yet being compassionate is hard. And I find compassion is a very good path to humility. When I was doing our annual report a couple years ago, I interviewed a woman to feature her story in our annual report. Her name is Deborah. She lives in Cedartown. She's 63. She lives with schizophrenia, which showed up when she was in high school. She was misdiagnosed for many years in the 70s and 80s, finally knows what it is. And I said, well, how did you discover that you had that? And she said, well, I was hearing voices. I was in high school. I played a basketball game. I thought the crowd was shouting, but it wasn't. I was hearing voices. I said, well, how long did that go on? Did you hear it? That? She said, well, I still hear them. I still hear voices. Well, I said, well, what about right now? She said, yeah, I'm hearing them right now. But I've learned how to push them down, how to ignore them, how to not let them distract me from that. So I'm sitting across a person who's had schizophrenia for 40 years she's lived with. She's hearing voices as I speak to her. And she's learned to not listen to those, to manage those. It was very humbling to sit across the table from her and ask her questions about her life, because she wanted to have the same life as everybody else. But on top of everything else she had to do, she had to push these voices down and not let them distract her. People do amazing things. They have been through a lot and they can still do it. She, through our supported employment program, we got her a job at the Cedar Valley Nursing Home. She worked there a couple years, never missed a day of work. Went on to her other job. Now she works for a catering company out in Cedartown, also has never missed a day of work. So tremendous work ethic. And yet she hears voices. So you never, I mean, you just never know. And it was amazing to talk to her. So compassion, recognizing that the person that you maybe had a not good encounter with, maybe they're having a bad day, maybe they have something else going on. Maybe it's not about you that they are being belligerent and terrible to you for, but it's because of them and they can't help it, but they're trying. Yeah, when I say seek treatment if you need it, my gosh, let's not be afraid of this in 2021. We've been through a heck of an experience over the past year. We know that mental illness has had a lot of impacted greatly by the pandemic. If you lost a family member, that is very difficult, but even feelings of isolation, anxiety going out in public. I think of high school seniors who missed so many milestones like prom and graduation, and they can really grieve for those things that you would normally expect to happen when you're 18 and they're taken away from you, from something beyond your control. If you need help, get help. If you're not sure, call a therapist or set up an appointment or ask your doctor and say, you know, here's what I've been feeling. Do you think that's normal? Do you think maybe I should talk to somebody? Sometimes the doctor will say yes. Sometimes they'll say, well, it seems normal to me. But if you don't believe that, seek out a therapist and get an appointment and go talk to somebody about your feelings. Because if you are experiencing mental illness, it's not just impacting you. It's impacting your family and your coworkers. So seek treatment if you need it. Don't be afraid of that. Finally, be an advocate and an ally to the extent that you can. We know that people getting help is important. We know having services available in the community is important. We are never going to get them all, right? But we know that a lot of people that are homeless, mental illness runs very high within the homeless population. So what policies can we advocate for? What can we just tell people if they encounter us on the streets or we encounter them on the streets? It's like, maybe you should go talk to somebody, a coworker, family member. Don't ever be afraid to say that to them. They may be insulted in first, but let's be advocates for good mental illness and having our communities that we live in be good communities for behavioral health care for everyone. And I'll let you decide what being an advocate on your terms means, but don't ever be afraid to talk about that. Finally, something else you can do now. This is going to sound like, oh, you made a good speech, and now here comes the sales pitch, and it's not that at all. But we do have a foundation. We started it a couple years ago, and all it does is it provides money and funding for Highland Rivers Health and our services. So in-kind donations, we certainly take those. Financial donations. A year ago, I think it was, gosh, do you ever feel like last year you can't really place? Was that like in 2020? Was that 2019? Or was that just like last month? And it's hard to tell sometimes. So I'm going to go with early 2020. We kicked off a campaign. Recovery begins with a good night's sleep. And we wanted to replace the mattresses and bedding in our 3 crisis stabilization units. So we've got 3 crisis stabilization units, 74 beds between them. People stay about a week. They get in behavioral health crisis. Maybe it's undiagnosed. Maybe they've gone off their meds. Maybe they need acute detoxification. So we stabilize them, step them down into more appropriate services, whether that's residential treatment or intensive outpatient. About 4,000 to 5,000 people a year go through our 3 crisis units. They stay about a week. For a lot of people, that is the first step on the road to recovery. We wanted to replace the mattresses. They operate 24/7, 365, our crisis units. It would just be nice to have better mattresses. So we kicked off this campaign. We weren't looking to raise a lot of money, but it was a five-digit goal that we had. And I will tell you, the Community Foundation of Northwest Georgia, David Aft, stepped up and said, we'll do this. We will fund all those mattresses and bedding. And they did. So a great thank you and a shout out to David Aft and the Community Foundation in Northwest Georgia. And of course, they get donations and gifts from people in the community. Well, we can do that too. What I like to say is that it really allows you to be creative. If you are really concerned about child and adolescent, we can make donations work for that. One of our community foundation in Cherokee County, the Smile Up Foundation, gave us a pot of money to the foundation and said, I want this to go to paying the copays and for services for families in Cherokee County that can't afford their copays or can't afford to do it. It had a very direct impact on the lives of people. We can certainly do that. If you are looking to establish a legacy, and I got to think big too when I make this non-sales pitch, this might be a good thing to explore. And we do have some priorities that we've identified, certainly child and adolescent. The Green Zone is a recovery community we are looking to establish in Cherokee County for veterans. Our CSUs, crisis service units, do need reservations. Personal care and home items, that's a big one. And we need a lot of stuff for that. Individuals, a lot of times, when they're through with crisis, they've gone through a residential program, they need a place to live. We move people into housing all the time, subsidized housing. A lot of the individuals we work with are on disability and qualify for housing vouchers in Section 8, and we work with that, and we visit them as part of the programs. There's so much stuff, and I was looking around our house because, you know, we got a new one a few years ago, back when it was affordable, my gosh. And you think about, what do you need for a household? Gosh, you know, stuff like dish soap and sponges and pots and pans and toilet paper, you know, there was a run on that, but you know, towels and bedding and pillows and just that stuff that we have probably all grown up with and take for granted that it's going to be in our house. And even when we moved into a new house, we brought it with us or we went out and bought new ones. But for some people, if this is the first time that they've lived on their own with not their parents, or if they've been homeless for the past 10 years, they don't have any of that. There's always, and I don't want to say, you know, take your stuff like you would to Goodwill and give it to Highland Rivers, you know, but certainly there is always a need for that sort of thing. So, so I'll make that, we can always use it. Baby blankets and stuff too. Generators, we do need some mission critical generators. And we're looking to do a couple of Mosaic Place, a recovery community in Cedartown. We also want to have some mini grants available for our employees because they work on the front lines and they know what people need, and they have a lot of great ideas about things that we could do to enhance this experience and to work with the individuals, but there's never money to do it. So those are some priorities. But certainly, if you want to make an impact and impact people directly in your community as it comes to mental health, to substance use, to individuals with disabilities, this we can work with you to do and set it up, and you can have a direct impact. So I hope that didn't sound too much like a sales pitch, but I wanted you to know that it was there. So anyway, there's my information. I put it in there because you'll be able to go back and look at that. So email and phone. We've got a website, obviously, our scheduling number for people to call. And after hours and weekends, Georgia Crisis and Access Line, they can help you get to us. Oh,
that does not work.
Well,
That does not work. I'm sorry.
there we go. And our
Call Highland Rivers.
call Highland Rivers.
Yes,
Well, I
call
appreciate
them
that.
directly. I mean,
Well, and our even though it's a 1-800 number, right? We've got 3 scheduling centers. So when we answer the phone, Highland Rivers Health is not an answering service. It's being answered by somebody who works for Highland Rivers, either in Dalton, in Cedartown, or in I'm sorry, in Dalton, Rome, or in Canton. So even though it's an 800 number, we have them. Ma'am.
So at once upon a time, I had a friend we were trying to help her. She went to, it's called ADAC back then.
Mhm. I've heard of that, but I'm not quite sure what that is. Oh, yeah.
And my other question is this the response, the
CSU.
to Georgia shutting down all the mental hospitals?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. We do know that individuals end up in crisis, and it's expensive for them to go to the emergency department if they're in crisis. They shut down in when, 2011? Was this move towards that? And I know that for the most people that were in there, they are able to live in the community on their own. I know some people also believe that maybe some people should still be kept or should still live in a state hospital. So, but I don't know because I've only been here 5 years, but our CEO could go back to the 60s with you on like the history of mental health in Georgia. So, but they do perform a very essential function and they're much cheaper than emergency departments. So.
Well, I just heard that they shut down the mental hospital, but I had never heard that they had a plan or what else.
Yeah, they have a plan, and actually the creation of community service boards coincided with the overall movement to shut down the state hospitals. Okay, yes. Oh, CSBs. I got you. Yes. So as people are not institutionalized anymore, they need to be able to access services in the communities. And that's when the community service boards were created and why. So, very good question. How am I doing on time? It's time. All right. I left you some. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And don't hesitate to contact me if I can ever ask her any questions for you.
Mike, thank you for being with us. A great presentation, and I know it's a year that we just came off. We need this refresher, so thank you. If everyone would stand, we'll say the pledge and we'll adjourn the meeting. I also just want to remind everyone, the board members, we have a board meeting right after this meeting, so we'll just meet one of these tables. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Of the things they say or do, is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned? June 8th. All right, June 8th. Jackson, good to see you. Okay. But I haven't